huge stuff happened yesterday. And I don't want to rehash the same stuff that was obvious from the developer blog, from the developer update video, and necessarily the patch notes. I want to dig a little bit deeper into the stuff that may not have been discussed about as much and just give my takes on things. So really exciting news yesterday from a business standpoint. Really exciting news from a hero update balance standpoint. Some of the discussion, we'll get into that in a second here. So really quick, hero release is all going to be free. Moving forward, again, pretty obvious. Check it out for yourself. All the mythic chains retroactively you'll be able to buy again. You're going to be getting more coins. They're looking to have big, crazy new changes occasionally. We don't know how often, but core changes to the gameplay, similar to Season 9 moving forward, which will keep things exciting. And the big thing here is obviously the map reworks. Coliseo, remove the glass. We don't know if they're going to be removing the glass. We're not 100% sure. We looked at the video very carefully in the release video, and it was almost like perfectly cropped. So I think they removed it, but we're not really sure. But then also Dorado, Circuit Royale, Havana, New Bonnie, which is like really, honestly, that might be 4 for 4 for me. If like I had to choose 4 maps besides Coliseo to rework and adjust, I actually think it would be these 4, which is like crazy. So that's super exciting. And there's some also new moves about a limited time clash trial on the new Hanaoka map. And then they're talking about Runasapi as well, which is another push map. So, you know, again, there's more information on this in the dev video. I'm not going to rehash the stuff that's already available out there. So anyway, really exciting news with all this stuff. That's awesome. That's great. But there's a couple of things that I actually want to talk about here. I want to talk a little bit about the patch notes here, because this is really enlightening. Now, this has happened a couple times before, but I don't know that we've seen this as quickly and as accurate. Now, there is a little bit of bias here. If you guys watched my previous video just talking about last week's patch, you'll know that I was a little bit concerned about the MAUGA buffs, because while I thought that the buffs were good, I was scared that MAUGA was going to be pushed into the meta. Turns out that was the case. I have some thoughts on that in just a second. Hold tight. I was also not a big fan of the EMP buff. That one in particular was something that I was really not happy about. And I was also a little bit concerned about the number of little etc. buffs that Symmetra got, specifically with like the Sentry health. I think that was a little bit too much. All of this stuff is reverted. All of this stuff. Not the teleporter buff is still there, which is a little odd. It was weird that they actually went after the primary fire. I guess that there's something in there that was imbalanced. I honestly did not play enough Symmetra to really get a feel for things. I think the turret health decrease is good. Obviously, the EMP decrease is good. And the good news is that MAUGA did keep his slam change, which is by far the most important and most healthy buff that he had, but they reverted this here. Now, I actually want to talk about this because there's a couple reasons why this is important. Not only is it like, oh, yay, they nerfed the things that Coach Spilo doesn't like. That must be healthy for the game, right? Well, obviously there's some bias there. I like it, but yeah. But actually it's more than that. It's the speed with which this happened. This was 1 week. 1 week we had this and it was fixed. There's a pace that's rapidly, no pun intended, being set by the Overwatch 2 developer team that is unprecedented with Overwatch 2 and Overwatch 1's past. Many of you guys might remember in Overwatch 1 where we would have metas like GOATS is the obvious one, but Broken Mercy, Broken Hanzo, and many more where things were just broken and honestly just as broken as MAUGA, maybe worse than current MAUGA. And it just sat. Now, I know some of you guys are like, well, we just had that with a recent MAUGA patch. I'm going to cut the developers a little bit of slack because that was the winter holidays, right? But regardless, this is something that we've not really been blessed enough to have for a long time. And it feels almost surreal, like how quickly these changes are happening. And also generally nerfing the right things too. Like they didn't revert the slam, which would have really irritated because that was like the one fun thing. They attacked the cardiac overdrive. They attacked a little bit of his HP. Now, MAUGA, to be fair, is still a really poorly designed character and needs a lot of work. We've gone over that many times. But this, in the short term, is good. And that's the other thing too. I actually like the idea of having some sort of sustain that wasn't timed to healing. The overhealth through cardiac overdrive was an interesting sustain idea. And I said so in the last video. And Alec Dawson agrees. Because Alec Dawson tweeted here, reverting some changes from our 2.91 patch, we may return to the MAUGA overhealth concept down the line, but peel more power back elsewhere in his kit. Safest and most sound thing for us to do right now was just to revert the cardiac overdrive buffs. And this is huge, guys. This is recognizing that there's a flawed design or that there's something wrong with the design. We like an aspect, but we can't have the aspect right now because he's just too OP for it. That's almost word for word what we were talking about last week. Now, I obviously, there's bias here, right? Like if he does what I like, then obviously I'm going to praise it, right? But I do think that that in general is a healthy way of approaching things, is that ultimately we would like MAUGA to be in that position. He's not quite there yet. We'll keep tweaking and working on it, and maybe he'll get there eventually. But in the meantime, we don't want to make you guys suffer through another MAUGA meta. And I feel like that's a really, really fair approach to things. And again, this is something that is kind of unprecedented. And before we move along, let's actually talk, because I realized something in the group up podcast with SVB. By the way, check that out. And I realized part of the reason why these kind of things are so problematic is when you talk about the buffs to difficult heroes, like the buffs to Zenyatta and Lucio, and buffs to Tracer and so on. Everyone's playing a little Lucio, everyone's playing a little Tracer, everyone's playing a little Wrecking Ball early in Season 9. It'd be clear that those metas were very popular, but even then the pick rates weren't like completely. You saw Zen Lucio literally every game. And did you ever think about why? Why did I literally not see Lin use Zen Lucio or Ball, whatever, every single game, even if they were strong? The reason is that because Zenyatta and Lucio are kind of hard. They have a little bit of a skill floor, a little bit of a skill ceiling, right? They're kind of tricky to play. Now, some of you were like, oh, Zen's easy to play. Yeah, but compared to MAUGA. The problem with buffing easy characters like MAUGA, without like properly adjusting their skill curve and so on, which we're getting there. But the problem with making these characters meta is that they affects every rank across the board, and it affects it immediately. You don't have to be a very good tank player to exploit a strong MAUGA. You don't have to be a very good DPS player to exploit a strong Bastion. And I'm going to make some people upset here, but you don't have to be a very strong Moira to exploit a strong Moira meta. Now, I don't think Moira's been quite as oppressive as some of those other characters, but I think it's just a good example of a support character that we wouldn't want to be, because it's not challenging, and every person in the player base can almost immediately capitalize off of those buffs. And that's why those buffs are the most dangerous. Easy heroes don't always necessarily scale well at the highest level, but even in top 500, you're seeing a lot of MAUGA, because even though he's a low skill character, everybody in top 500 with top 500 level mechanics and game sense is able to immediately capitalize off of the Cardiac Overdrive buff. And if they buffed Winston or Diva or Wrecking Ball, not every player would be able to immediately capitalize off of that, because it's a little bit more challenging to use the capabilities of that character provides. Like, for example, Lucio meta, you still didn't see Lucio in every game, because Lucio's a really unique and difficult character to play. And that's something that we have to kind of keep in mind. I'm not saying that you can't buff these lower rank heroes, and we've already heard from the developers' lips that they like mixing up the meta. They don't like having the same characters meta all the time, which I think is a fair way of approaching things. But when easier characters get buffs, they generally tend to dominate the meta faster and for longer, because of the reasons that I clarified earlier. And I think that's always something that it's more to remember. It's not that having easy characters is boring and bad for the game just because they're easy, but it's because the very fact that they're easy is what makes them so ubiquitous. And you'll see, that's why you see MAUGA every game. And even in a strong Winston meta, you don't see Winston every game. It's not because MAUGA is necessarily stronger than Winston all the time, although that's probably the case. It's the fact that it's so easy to capitalize off of easy hero strengths. Now, let's talk about one other thing. A little quick side note here, because there was not all positivity about yesterday. There was some whining from some of the pro community. OWL players discovering the classic change patch 2 days before an important match with the OWCS Tier 2 special after Overwatch League ended. I believe Backbone tweeted about this as well. Christopher, Overwatch community needs to make a list of heroes that are not allowed to be buffed so Blizzard can focus on balancing the fun heroes. The ones I like are acceptable, ha ha ha. Backbone as well, I think, made a tweet about it. Needed OPR right now on God, right? So the OPR was basically, you guys remember PTR from Overwatch 1? Back in the day, there was a separate server that you could log into that was playing on an old patch, so pro stuff wasn't messed up as well. And then Rack Attack as well. Other than my match in 2 days is on a whole new meta. And then he even says here, mad respect to the dev team, but please give us our OPR back if we're doing this. So the thing here, basically, the thing here is what's happening with the pro meta is that like right before important matches, stuff is getting reverted. Now, I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. I would rather not watch MAUGA meta, and honestly, I just don't, especially now that I'm out of the pro scene, I have a little bit of bias where I don't care that you guys have to relearn a meta in 2 days or figure out what you're going to play in 2 days, because even this past weekend with MAUGA meta was like the worst week of professional Overwatch that we've had in quite a long time. It was unbelievably boring to watch. Even looking at some POVs on stream yesterday, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. It just is boring to watch. And ironically here, this is coming from maybe a little bit of critique here for Christopher. You guys are the ones that want to stream scrims because it's good content. That's part of the tax that you have to play. If it's good content to stream scrims, it's also good content to not have a MAUGA meta. And so I actually think that while we should have the we should try to aim to have these patches happening not around match times. It's also tricky with OWCS with how frequently these matches are happening. There's not really these long breaks with which to sort stuff out. And to be honest with you, professional Overwatch is not enough of a priority for the rest of the player base to have to suffer. So yes, we would love to have OPR bat, maybe. But you know what? It might have been unhealthy for the pro scene to have another week of MAUGA meta. Maybe it's in our best interest to sacrifice competitive integrity to make it more enjoyable to watch. I'm being devil's advocate here. I can understand the frustration of having the patch change. I played back in Contenders in 2020 when the patch was changing every 2 weeks through the hero bans. It was a total disaster. I hated it. But if that's the price that we have to pay to keep the meta from MAUGA, then I'm sorry that that's the price that we have to pay, and I think that's something that we need to be considering it. So again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. It's not that these points aren't fair. It's not that I don't agree. It's just something that I think this whole discussion is a lot more complicated. Again, remembering that priority needs to be an entertaining and fun meta, or at least finding a better balance between that and competitive integrity. Finally, one other detail I wanted to talk about here. Let me actually pull up Overwatch really fast because this is something I was thinking about. I've given some of this feedback to the developers. Just food for thought, guys. I was watching a video last night from a coach called Relth, and there was a really interesting video about how the Overwatch 2 tank problem, and there was a different perspective. And basically, we got into a discussion on Twitch stream, again, about the psychology of tanking. And one thing I realized, and I think that you guys might want to put some thought into this, and let me know what you guys think, is that the psychology of tanking is that the challenge is that even if shooting the tank and putting cooldowns into the tank isn't good, it's really easy to do. And so what we've discussed historically is like giving ways for tanks to counterplay these cooldowns or reducing the effectiveness of the cooldowns. But then I thought of something else. What's the difference between Sigma and MAUGA? Which one is more attractive to shoot? What's the difference between D.Va and Roadhog? And which one is more attractive to shoot? And I came to realize that tanks that have damage mitigation strictly through healing or health pool are actually are really attractive to shoot. You look at a character like D.Va, okay? She's got a head hitbox that's a little bit tricky to shoot. She has Matrix, and she can also move, which means that she can be tricky to shoot as well, all right? So while D.Va is something that is attractive to shoot, is she attractive as Roadhog, who has no shielding, no Matrix, no movement, no mobility, no nothing, no shields, no nothing, right? I actually realized that in many ways, the tank focus problem is exacerbated specifically with tanks that don't have damage mitigation outside of raw healing. I think the short list I had here was hitbox problems, shields problems, matrixes, and or a lack of mobility. So what I want to propose is when we think about like what's the tank psychology problem, not only should we introduce counterplay and maybe some work with the tank passive, but I actually think that you should seriously look at the type of damage mitigation and learn from your lessons from tanks like Sigma, who have a slimmer hitbox, a shield, and a shift. Learn from tanks like Wrecking Ball, which have a lack of a head hitbox when they're moving around. Not necessarily that that's going to be something that we're going to be able to replicate, but also can move quickly, which makes him harder to shoot. And because of that, he's slightly less attractive to shoot than, say, something like a Roadhog. Right? Same thing with Zarya. She has a bubble. Even Reinhardt with his massive hitbox and whatever, at least has a shield with which to mitigate damage as well. And so what I'm thinking here is if we think about the psychology of what needs to make Roadhog or MAUGA less of a cooldown and damage punching bag, we've obviously talked about how forms of damage mitigation through healing alone are just fundamentally broken, but I think they might also be broken psychologically. We need to find ways to not discourage people from shooting MAUGA, but makes it less satisfying to shoot MAUGA. And I wonder if that starts with something as simple as hitbox manipulation, to where it's not quite as easy to shoot MAUGA, so that you're not always so tempted to just turn your brain off and shoot MAUGA. Because that's the problem. It's not always good to shoot MAUGA. Sometimes he's unkillable. But the problem is that we still do it. Why? Because it's so easy and it feels so good. Just headshots, headshots, headshots. If I'm playing, not even a Zenyatta. Like if I'm playing Torbjorn here, it might be more effective for me to put attention on shooting the enemy tracer. But why would I when I could do this? Right? It's just wonderful, right? And that's the problem with many of these tanks is that this is all you could do. I mean, listen to how juicy that is, right? This is like the equivalent of like white noise to fall asleep at night, right? And I'm wondering if that's something that we need to consider as well. Is not just the fact that, these tanks don't have counterplay for CC and damage and just being damage sponges, but the very nature of some of these tanks makes them so attractive to shoot. And then that's why they've done well with Junker Queen, who has a little bit of mobility with her shout. But really, the biggest thing that Junker Queen really benefited from was a slightly slender hitbox. So it made her a little bit harder to shoot. And even subconsciously, you might not even realize it, but you're slightly less attracted to shooting a Junker Queen than you are a Roadhog, even though both rely a little bit off of self-healing and both have, okay, Junker Queen does have shout, like I said, but both don't really have a ton of mobility and really no shields. But Junker Queen's harder to shoot, so you're more lenient with letting her live. Maybe not dumping every single cooldown into her, unless it's like a Bionade, right? Just because it's a little bit harder to hit her. And I think that that's something that we have to consider. Even a character like Doomfist, ironically, because he has no form of damage mitigation besides his mobility, is something that people tend to focus a lot just because, oh, he's really easy to shoot and really satisfying to shoot. And even a character like Orisa, when she's fortifying, even though you can't crit her when she's fortifying, you're still getting the tickies. And I see in low to mid ranks all the time people focusing the fortified Orisa. The idea here is that we want to make what's good for the player also feel good. And what's good for lower rank and mid rank players is often not focusing tank. So what ends up happening is that you have low rank players that are handicapping themselves by only shooting the tank, right? And not taking duels and shooting supports and taking off angles, right? So that's hurting their ability to capitalize and win games, but it's also making it feel really bad for the enemy tank. And while part of this is definitely a 5v5 issue, I think this is something that we can actually psychologically address by making it feel not as good to do the bad thing. If it feels good, it should be the right thing. If it feels bad, it should be the wrong thing. And I think that's something that we need to be trying to aim for. So anyway, that's all I've got. Maybe just a bit of a segue there, but I think it's food for thought. Food for thought. Anyway, that's all I got. Enjoy the rest of your week, and let's hope that this kind of stuff continues to happen more often whenever there's these these hot fixes, these patch changes, this communication. It's unprecedented. So, let's make sure that we reward good changes with good feedback. I think the developers are human as well. So if you get the opportunity to say something nice or kind to a developer on Twitter or wherever else, or just to give overall positive feedback, not necessarily if you don't like it all, give negative feedback. If you don't like the sim nerfs, give negative feedback. But do we have to appreciate the good changes with the bad? And for the most part, I think these are pretty good changes.